So in order to be on time, we will proceed with no further delay to the next session on rectal cancer with two distinguished oncologists. Dr. Glynne Jones is well known for his pioneering work on rectal cancer and hand cancer as well as integration of novel drugs to standard chemoradiation. So we are happy and honored to invite him for his first talk on standard and novel regimens for the improvement of complete response rates. And we kindly ask to stick on time.
Well, thank you very much, Evangelist, for inviting me to this brilliant meeting in this lovely place. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about trying to improve complete response. That's my disclosures. And the issue is not just how to improve complete response, but you don't want to sort of take any detriment to that by impairing your function, because then that would, I mean, one could probably crank up the dose of radiotherapy to 70 or 80 gray, but then you wouldn't have any function in your rectum. So in resectable cancers, we have two modalities really, either short course 5x5 gray, and although you can just perform immediate surgery, you can also wait, or conventionally fractionated radiotherapy with chemotherapy, and then you perform the surgery 4 to 10 weeks later, and we're getting longer and longer in the way we do that. The problem is that chemoradiation wasn't designed to be a curative modality. It was designed to shrink things down and reduce the local recurrence rate, but it wasn't designed to be curative, and about a third of patients don't respond terribly well, and maybe 10 or 25%, depending on how big it is or what stage it is, will have a pathological complete response or complete response. But I think it's important that the way we are right now is most patients are not going to achieve sustained local control unless surgery is added. And there is quite a lot of morbidity, and the late morbidity, it's not caused by the surgery, but it's certainly contributed by the combination of radiotherapy and surgery. So I think we need to keep those in mind. And if you look at the data across the board, you will have a pathological complete response in about 15% of patients, and maybe, depending again on your stage and size, a complete clinical response up to 20 or 30%. And the PCR with short course is a little bit less. But maybe it's a little bit less because people don't wait quite long enough. There's some recent data come out from the Netherlands suggesting that if you compare chemoradiotherapy and short course, that the path-CR rate is a bit lower. But most of these studies produce a path-CR rate of around 10 or 12%. Some others have a lower. Again, it will depend on the actual stage of the cancers right at the beginning. So maybe there's quite a variety, 33 days, 47 days, 63 days. And Krzysztof Bojko from Poland, this is a Polish 2 study, he has always told me that actually you need to be thinking about the time from the first fraction of radiotherapy to your surgery. So if you have a standard chemoradiotherapy regimen, from the first fraction of your radiotherapy to surgery is about 12 weeks in most settings. And he says that it should be the same for short course. And that's why he designed this Polish 2 trial, where the date of surgery was 12 weeks in both arms. So they had the control arm was chemoradiotherapy, and the novel arm was short course, followed by 3 courses of FOLFOX, and then operating at 12 weeks. And although not significantly different, with short course in this context, the PCR was 16%. Now whether that's just waiting a bit longer, or whether it's waiting a bit longer and adding the FOLFOX 3 courses. And again, it's very similar to, this is the data from the phase 2 from Julio Garcia Aguilar, where he sequentially added in FOLFOX after chemoradiotherapy, so extending the time and adding in sequential courses of FOLFOX. So in the first cohort, he had a PCR rate of about 11%. In the second cohort, after 2 cycles of FOLFOX, 25%, and going up to 6 cycles of FOLFOX, so 3 months of FOLFOX, where in that cohort they achieved a pathological complete response rate of 38%. The problem is, the real issue I have with this trial is that they don't give you enough information in the paper for you to really make up your mind. If you go back and look at most of the trials of chemoradiotherapy, by the time you put together PCR and just a few scattered cells, you get to about 35 or 40% in most of those trials. And so what I would wanted to know is, what is the combination of TRG1 and TRG2 in these groups? Because if you've got a path-CR rate of 38%, is your TRG2 virtually none, or is it, again, about 15 or 20%? And again, the nodal positivity is not given in this trial. So we don't know how much the chemotherapy is contributing to that, and how much is just waiting a bit longer. So there are strategies that you can use to increase the complete clinical response rate, and one of those is just to crank up the dose of radiotherapy, and we have very sophisticated ways of doing that. Papillon for very small lesions, but if you're going to use sort of papillon, it needs to be smaller than about 3 centimeters, and it needs to be not quite right down the bottom end, because it's quite difficult to do. Brachytherapy is another option. We can give IMRT a simultaneous integrated boost. There are very many ways that we can do that. And we can also add chemotherapy, either concurrently or before or after chemoradiotherapy or surgery. And you can wait longer with any of those options. So, Habragama recently did 3 things at once. So, she and her team escalated the dose of radiotherapy from a standard of 50.4 Gray to 54 Gray. They extended the period of assessment, and they actually filled that with more 5FU chemotherapy. Their regimen is a bit strange because they only used 3 days of 5FU in those, but they extended this with a small number of patients, 70 patients, and then they published the results in these 70 patients. And what they did was so that in T2 cancers, if you took specifically T2 cancers, you could extend the proportion of patients that did not require surgery and had not required surgery at 5 years from 30% in their standard regimen to up to 67% with the extended. But these are very small numbers, but nevertheless there is a signal there that if you take early tumours and you do these things, adding a little bit more chemotherapy, adding the dose, that you can achieve more complete clinical responses. The problem is, earlier this year, they also published some data saying that actually this was confined to patients with T2N0, and that you could not extrapolate that to patients who had T3 cancers, and should be considered with care when advising patients in clinical practice. It's quite a cautious statement from that group. I think it's probably the first cautious statement that I've ever seen from that group. Anyway, I think it's worth keeping in mind. And as we know, the dose of radiotherapy will depend on the T stage, the size of the tumour, end stage bit, and the type of histology, whether it's mucinous or particularly signet ring, which I think are relatively resistant. The site, people think that the low rectal cancers may be slightly more sensitive than the upper ones, and also the tumour microenvironment in terms of all the sort of immune and other functions. So your best bet is to select. So if you want to get complete clinical response, the best way is to select a nice early stage, a small tumour, which doesn't have any circumferential margin that's involved. You can't see any lymph nodes on the scan. Your extramural vascular invasion isn't there. Your CA is nice and low. And you actually sort of put into the mix as well a few biomarkers for response, wild-type RAS, maybe even the immunoscore if you've got it. I don't know whether you could do immunoscore on just the biopsy. And then select how long you wait. And you could do pretty well if you do that. I bet I could probably crank up the complete clinical response to maybe 30 or 40% if I did that. And to some extent, this is what the Dutch group have done with Arnie Appelt's data, where she selected patients which had low cancers, 6 centimeters from the anal verge. Now you can see from her data, published in The Lancet 2-3 years ago, that more than half of these patients were actually clinically T2 on MRI, and about a quarter of them were T3s, but they're really small diameters, 2.8 centimeters. I don't think I've ever treated, in terms of a locally advanced cancer, a 2.8 centimeter diameter tumour. They're all, in my database, the median size is about 4.85 centimeters. So these are selected out to be very small tumours. And she did get spectacular results by taking the dose up to 60 Gray in 30 fractions of the primary tumour, and they gave an endorectal brachytherapy boost and spectacular clinical complete response in 78% of patients, and many of these were actually maintained. But there is a downside to that. A lot of these patients got bleeding as a sequelae of that, and we don't know what their late function actually is for these patients. And I think that there is an onus on this group to publish some data about what the late function, not just at 1 year, 2 years, but the late function at 4 or 5 years. Because in my experience with chemoradiation, that your function is not too bad for the first 3 or 4 years, but after 5 years after chemoradiation, it's a bit worse, and at 10 years, it's a lot worse. So I would like to know what the eventual function of some of these patients is. So this was a meta-analysis saying the impact of radiotherapy boost, you can do pretty well. You can dose escalation above 60 Gray results in high PCR rates and acceptable early toxicity. Note the word early there, early toxicity. I mean, there's quite a lot of data from some prostate radiotherapy that once you go above 56 Gray to most of the sphincter, that you are beginning to cause problems in the way it works. And so frankly, I'm not sure that I want 60 Gray with external beam to my rectal sphincter, but there we go. So that's what they said in the conclusion. But the randomized trials actually don't really seem to show much of a difference, because these randomized trials, 26% versus 26%, 18% versus 18%, 7% versus 11% for the increased dose of radiotherapy, which doesn't say that there's a great take-home message that you're getting a great advantage from cranking up the dose of radiotherapy. Again, previous data from Denmark does show that you can get a major response from increasing the dose, but mainly in those patients that are really quite small. And again, if you look at these patients who have small tumours, less than 3.7 centimetres, and you can see that there is quite a difference in the major response in terms of TRG1 and TRG2. So again, if you select small tumours, early tumours, then there probably is more mileage in increasing the dose of radiotherapy than it is to big tumours. And big tumours, the volume of treatment that you'll be taking to large doses will be bigger as well. So you're likely to have more late morbidity from big tumours, but there's another talk about that shortly. So one of the things that has always, this is very old data, going back to about 40 years ago, that is preclinical work where the mean lethal dose in the Petri dish against colonic cancer was 94 Gray. Okay? And this is very similar to what Arnie Appelt in her model showed, that if you wanted to have a complete response for 50% of the patients, you would probably have to crank up the dose to 90 Gray. Now you can do that with Papillon, because you can take very small areas, very superficial doses, to very high doses without compromising the function of the rectum and without causing necrosis. But you can't do that to larger volumes of tumour. So the point I would make is that PCR and complete clinical response, they are not quite the same. There's some linkage between them, but early T1 tumours will show you a high PCR and a high rate of CCR. And there's good agreement there, and it's much clearer at a very early stage for the early tumours than it is for the later tumours, because the later, bigger tumours tend to ulcerate, and they're more difficult to tell whether they are actually in complete remission or not. So we know that this is old data from MAS, that your T stage has a very big impact on the complete clinical response. So when we've tried to put into the mix concurrent oxaliplatin, these are all trials for locally advanced rectal cancer, T3, 4, N+. And the STAR, Accord, the German trial, the Americans, PETAC 8 and 4, none of these trials really show a major difference except for the FOAC trial, which is a strange trial, I think. I think the Chinese have a different biology. The causes of their cancers are slightly different anyway. But they don't give you a consistent signal that integrating oxaliplatin in stage T3-4 gives you a high pathological complete response rate. But if you go back to the ACOSOG trial, which actually they had to play down the dose of oxaliplatin because of toxicity, but nevertheless, if you selected patients that were small and T2s, you could get pathological complete responses up to 44%, nearly half the patients. So in larger tumours, you get a much lower pathological complete response, and there's a much lower agreement between those because ulceration and fibrosis may not mean the tumour is present. And you often have to wait a lot longer before you actually can say this is a complete clinical response. And I think part of that is because tumours that are bigger tend to respond, particularly those patients who have disease which goes out to the circumferential margin or even beyond the circumferential margin. Those patients, when they're resected, they tend to have a response which is much more likely to be fragmentation, whereas the early tumours tend to shrink back towards the endoluminal point of origin. And so you're much easier to salvage those tumours that are early because they tend to shrink back to the point of origin. So the other thing that I think has impressed me is if you actually, with the MRI, you can define stage 3 much more accurately in terms of the actual substage. So you can measure the extent through the muscularis propria, and if you have a relatively early T3A, T3B tumour, you can have, this is just a sort of retrospective, you can have up to 35% pathological complete responses, whereas by the time you get to an involved circumferential resection margin, which is 10 millimeters beyond the muscularis propria, the chance of you actually getting a pathological complete response is much less, at about 6%. The problem is most trials don't use the MRI. So, because nowadays we're all using MRI, but the historical trials did not have their entry criteria in terms of MRI. And that is a big difficulty for us all. But even the trials that are coming now are not substaging T3, which I think we should be doing, into T3A, B, C, and D, so that you can distinguish those. Because I think there is very little difference in the response that you can expect if you are T2N0 or if you are T3A-N0. That's only 1 millimeter, and I doubt it has a huge impact on your lymph node positivity. So, what about induction chemotherapy? Well, they too will give you higher rates, but there are caveats in terms of those patients who are PT0 and N0. I think the GREC-R4 trial is a really interesting trial because this is a trial where the patients were selected to be really advanced. I think 90% of these patients had a threatened circumferential margin. So it's totally the opposite of the Garcia-Aguilar trial. These patients are really advanced. And what they did was they gave the patients FOLFIRINOX up front. And if they had an excellent response, which was defined as, I think, 70% reduction in the size, then you were randomized to either going straight to surgery or chemo-rad. If you had a poor response or a lesser response, you were randomized to standard chemo-rad or chemo-rad with an escalated dose. And these are very small numbers, but again, if you look at the extramural extension of these tumours, those ones that originally were quite small, 6 and 4, those are the patients that actually had an extremely good response to the FOLFIRINOX that they gave. So I think, again, earlier tumours, even with chemotherapy, those are the ones that are going to respond well. And the group B that had FOLFIRINOX followed by chemo-rad had a 58% pathological complete response. I don't know what their clinical complete response was, it's not in the paper. So in conclusion, if you increase the dose of radiotherapy, it's going to be different depending on your T stage and probably your N stage. Compared to T3 and T4, you're going to get much better if it's early. You could do Papillon, and Papillon I think is there are strategies where we can shrink the cancer down so that Papillon is suitable, which I think we're going to see a lot more of at the moment. The OPERA trial is proceeding in Europe, and I think they're recruited about 90 patients. The majority of patients who do achieve a path-CR, they're probably node negative, many of these patients. But I think that you've got a lot more mileage in dose escalating the radiotherapy in patients who've got early tumours than you have in dose escalating the patients with advanced tumours, because I suspect that using bigger volumes, you'll get worse late effects even if you get complete response, which you're less likely to get. And we have very, very little data for patients who have not proceeded to surgery, and in the later, what are their late functions? Again, early tumours probably don't affect your function too much, whereas more advanced tumours involving the sphincters and things probably would anyway, even if you make it go away, will have more late effects. In terms of chemotherapy, I think both induction and consolidation after chemo-rad look quite promising, but we have no idea of the optimal regimen. What drugs we should be using? Should we be using FOLFIRINOX? Should we be using FOLFIRINOX and biologicals? What is the intensity that we need? What about the number of cycles we should have? The duration? We really haven't even started to look at these. But I think we need randomized trials with active regimens that are not just FOLFOX or XELOX, because you have a different aim here. You are not aiming for early tumours to improve the metastatic rate. So the fact that irinotecan does not work in the post-operative adjuvant setting, I think you can ignore. If you just want response, you can use FOLFOXIRI. You can use FOLFOXIRI and biologicals. And those are the trials that I think we need to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comprehensive talk. There are no questions up here. Are there any questions from the floor?
So, you almost suggest that we are about to suggest radiotherapy for every rectal cancer for different scope. For those who are early in order to preserve the organ, and those who are locally advanced in order to make them operable and.
Vetter's asked me to do a talk, which is how can you increase the complete response? So if you have a patient that says, I am not going to have a stoma, okay, over my dead body, what I call refuseniks, okay, the guy right at the beginning says, I am not going to have a stoma. We all have these patients, okay, so what are you going to do? You say, some of these patients who are going to have chemoradiotherapy, I don't select this, but if they're going to have chemoradiotherapy anyway, you say to the patient, well, what if this doesn't work as well as you think it's going to work? And the guy says, I'm not going to have a stoma. So in those circumstances, I'm going to increase the intensity, I'm going to up the dose of radiotherapy. But I would not select this guy at the beginning and say, oh, if I give you a higher dose of radiotherapy, you might not need his services. No.
Yes, thank you for a very nice talk. I have a question in line with that, because we all agree upon that the problem is not the big tumors, the advanced cases, because they should have had anyhow. The problem is the small tumors, and as you beautifully stated here, we have rough predictive markers like the size, like the T-stage, but do you think we will have in the near future the possibility actually to select upfront to not induce? Because with that strategy, we now will induce a lot of losers also, because half of them will not respond and need surgery anyhow. But do you think we or what's your thought of the way forward to find the markers that we could, with just a big bite in front of the therapy, could tell who will respond and not?
Okay, well, I'm going to say something that you can laugh at in the future. But for me, we have spent 100 years looking for radiosensitivity markers. Okay, and we have nothing that is clinically useful in the clinic. Okay, for me, I think we've been looking in the wrong place, and actually the immune environment may well be able to tell us that. But it's going to be very, very complex. It's not just here is something which has a lymphocytic infiltration. It is going to be much more complex. But I think personally, I believe that the immune environment is going to enable us to say, this patient should maybe have radiotherapy, this patient should need a high dose or a lower dose, this patient should have chemotherapy, personally.
So, yeah.
I haven't looked at that, but we are doing for peritoneal metastasis chemosensitivity testing. We put nodules onto mice or make 3D models and then test them for chemotherapy response. And perhaps you have the possibility, if you have, for instance, induction chemotherapy, you first take a biopsy, have the time for generating 3D models or mouses, and can test whether this is responding on treatment, and then go back like translational research and bring that back to the patients for something like this. So this is the next step for us. At the moment, we just do the testing.
I guess the answer is, yeah, it's interesting with the environment, but also that we should have to put, I think, different efforts to come further, because, as you say, practically everything has
we've not been very successful.
No, so that's true. So I think we should go on, and I can ask Professor Glynne Jones to stay on the podium to take the next talk. That is a very highly topical subject as well. It's markers for defining the optimal interval from the end of treatment to surgery. So please.
Right, well, I think it leads on a little bit into this. So we have we've got three things. We've got short course immediate surgery. How many of you in the room still use short course and immediate surgery?
Selectively.
Selectively. Well, not many of us. Right. So, well, a lot of you won't be interested in some of this. So, short course, preoperative radiotherapy and delayed surgery. Who uses that?
Selectively.
Selectively. So all the rest of you use chemo-rad?
Yes.
Well, okay.
Not selectively, generally.
So, well, you may... So short course, the accepted wisdom is you do your radiotherapy, you operate within 11 days, otherwise you get more surgical complications and things. If you're not going to do that, you probably need to wait. And I'm not sure that that's altogether logical, but this is data from Ben Glimelius showing that certainly the short course and waiting more than 8 weeks is going up and up and up, and that's a much more common strategy than it used to be. The optimal timing to achieve response or for safety. So these are the two issues that we try to balance. Sort of how do we get as much mileage out of the response as we can without actually allowing time for the patient to recover without prejudicing the surgery. But going back to what we were just talking about before, I think there might be other things. There is the concerns for the CRM. If you use, there's a recent paper, a retrospective paper, showing if you wanted to achieve R0 after short course and wait, you had to wait at least 20 days. So what about the immune system? What about considering the optimal time for the immune system? Because there's a lot of things going on there. We're creating a lot of neoantigens with 5x5 grey, and maybe we're getting the immune system, I mean, particularly in something that's CMS2, which is like the Gobi Desert in terms of your immune system, maybe we are getting some reaction there. So the biomarkers that we already have, we've been through these, the immunological, immunoscore, TILs, the inflammatory systemic markers, CEA, and all the molecular markers. We've got all these to play with. I have been impressed by this particular trial, which is very small, 13 patients. And what they did was they were looking at myeloid-derived suppressor cells and Tregs, which are the things that are going to suppress your immune system, the things that the cancer has mobilized to suppress your own immune system. And what they did was they looked at these at various time points, before the 5x5, and sort of 4 weeks later, and then about sort of 8 weeks later, and then just at the time of surgery. And what they found was that, I know it's a busy slide, but in all of these, there is a trough for all these inhibitory things that is a bit later. And it comes down to about 50 to 52 days is probably the time when these are at their lowest. So surely, isn't that going to be a time that would be best for you to operate, when the patient's own defences supporting the cancer are going to be at their lowest? And there is some data that is a randomised trial with only 77 patients in each arm. PCR rate was 10%, and showing that in terms of overall survival, there was a better overall survival for those patients who actually you extended the time to surgery 4 to 5 weeks rather than operating 7 to 10 days later. So a small trial. The Stockholm 3 trial, which is a large randomized trial with several hundred patients looking at short course and delayed surgery versus short course and surgery, that didn't show any particular difference. The overall survival and the PFS was the same. The PCR was like 11%, but the surgery interval was 47 days, which may be longer than you need. Things may be returning by that stage. So if you stand back and you think about a vaccination, you vaccinate or you have a virus or whatever, you will find that the CD8 T cells will respond within a few days with a maximum of about 7 to 15 days. And at the same time as you're doing that, the Tregs will come in because your immune system will also put its foot on the brakes at the same time as you're actually creating these CD8 cells to deal with the virus. So the memory cells are going to take you at least 7 days. Okay? Nothing before 7 days will be any memory cells. So if you operate if you do short course Monday to Friday, and then you operate on the following Monday, all your memory cells that are going to be are in the bucket. Because you've not left them in long enough in the patient to get to the lymph nodes, the dendritic cells, or to get into the systemic system. So, in the Dutch TME trial, where the average number of days between the beginning of surgery, the beginning of radiotherapy and surgery was 9 days, patients who had an extensive inflammatory infiltrate had half the local recurrence rate, 3.4% versus 6.9%. And the presence of intratumoral T cells, you had half the rate of metastases. So the immune system is certainly important in that trial. And just to show you, it was much more important, interestingly, in stage 2, much bigger varieties. Those are sort of the dotted line at the top there is those are a lot of infiltration and this is little, so it's quite discriminatory, that, a bit less so in terms of stage 3. So in the Dutch TME trial, the control arm that had no radiotherapy, this is the patients who were not irradiated, 18% of those patients had an extensive inflammatory reaction. So on day 8, if you radiated Monday to Friday and you operate the following Monday, how many patients, what do you think the inflammatory reaction is going to be? Is it going to be more? Is it going to be less? Who would think it's more? Who would think it's less? Yeah, most of you think it's going to be less. So, on day 8, it was completely obliterated. That inflammatory reaction, which is responsible for halving the rates of recurrence and metastatic disease, was completely obliterated. So are those patients disadvantaged by having an operation on day 8? Well, I don't know. So here's the curve going up back to, after about day 12, it's back to the standard of the control. But is it going to go up, or is it going to go down flat? And or is it going to go down further? But it might be that if you're thinking about the immune system rather than response or surgical morbidity, that somewhere around here is the ideal time to operate after short course. So if there's an ideal time to operate after short course, then maybe there's an ideal time to operate after chemo-rad. We just don't know it. So, interestingly, the Polish TRUE trial, where these patients had fixed T3, T4 tumours, so they were advanced tumours, and again, as I said in the previous talk, that they had 12 weeks to surgery in both arms, so short course and FOLFOX versus chemo-rad. And in this trial, this is where those patients would have started their chemotherapy. So those patients would have started their chemotherapy at that stage, and FOLFOX will almost certainly reduce your Tregs and your MDSCs, because they are much more sort of sensitive to that. So maybe that is why there is a difference in overall survival for those patients in the Polish 2 trial who had short course and FOLFOX as compared to chemoradiotherapy. Maybe. Speculative. So the Rapido trial, I think, is really, really very interesting, and this is really basing the same sort of principle. So if, like me, you believe there may be an ideal time to operate, and we don't know it, the fact that you actually integrate Capox after 5 times 5 gray, my prediction is that that will be a better arm, and that you will have, I think you will meet your endpoint for that trial. I would be very surprised if you don't meet your primary endpoint in that trial, but we will see. We will have to see. Anyway, chemoradiotherapy, the hypothesis is that the longer interval you have, up to about 15 weeks, will enhance your pathological complete response rate. And there's lots of data on that, but it doesn't seem to affect your CRM rate or your R0 resection rate in the same way. And that was much more sort of stable. So we know from very early data, back the Lyon trial, that when you gave 39 in 13 fractions just radiotherapy, there was a difference between 2 weeks and 6 to 8 weeks in terms of the clinical complete response rate and pathological complete response rate with a few cells. But again, it did not impact on survival. But in terms of your response rate, there was certainly a difference for those. And it's interesting, this again is data from Ben Clemelia showing that actually we are also getting longer and longer in the way that we tend to wait after chemoradiotherapy. So that's also getting longer. This is sort of population data from the Netherlands, which again I think is interesting because it backs onto what I was saying previously, that the treatment interval differs in terms of your responses, whether you have early tumours or larger tumours. And the early tumours respond very quickly, and then they tend to sort of keep responding a little bit, but the more advanced tumours do not sort of behave in quite the same way. So we have 2 randomised trials. Well, I think there are 3 randomised trials, but the other one is very small. So there's 2 randomised trials. There's the Marsden trial, which is only being presented in abstract form at ESMO, and there's the GRECR6 trial. And these trials have somewhat opposite results, really. So the GRECR trial was surgery at 7, randomising between 7 and 11 weeks, because they considered the standard as 6 to 8 weeks. And the Marsden trial had 6 versus 12 weeks, but it works out, I think, more like 7 and 14 weeks. So there's a slight difference there. Also, I think you were more permissive in the GRECR6 trial about your timing of surgery. So I think it probably will work out more like 7.5 to 8 weeks versus 10.5 weeks. So I think it'll be a bit, it looks a bit narrow when you read the paper. Anyway, if we look at the GRECR6, 265 patients, randomised, complete pathological response, 15% at 7 weeks, 17% at 11 weeks. No difference between those significant. If you look at the Marsden paper, they don't actually say pathological complete response. They either give you YPT0 or TRG1. But certainly in both of these, there is a significant difference. We don't know what the mean waiting time before resection in those, it wasn't in that presentation. But I think it sounds as if it's a bit longer, the gap is a bit longer. So how do we explain that? Well, I'm not sure we're actually comparing like with like, because it may be that there are more early tumours in the Marsden group, which would make a difference in terms of the response there. I don't think in GRECR you have any MRIs initially to use your staging, and I don't think there's any restaging in GRECR either. And I think there's perhaps a wider interval. But I mean, we need to have the Marsden paper published in there as well so that we can have a look at that. But I think that might explain the difference between these 2 trials. So, in conclusion, we may need to rethink the interval to surgery after short course and immediate surgery, because I think we could be disadvantaging some patients if we operate very early. That's not relevant to you lot because you don't use it, but it's relevant to us in the UK, and there are some groups in the UK where about 30 or 40% of their patients are having short course and immediate surgery. The optimal interval after chemoradiotherapy remains undefined, and I wonder whether we should actually be thinking in terms of the immune system and looking for immune markers on a sequential thing. I'll tell you one of the things, I haven't presented any data here, but we did some work where we did sequential MRIs on these patients at 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks, on a very small number of patients, I think 16 patients. And you could see these patients after chemoradiotherapy, the tumours were shrinking, the tumours were getting smaller, but we also biopsied these patients. And about half the patients, we did a COMET assay, and about half the patients showed that these were repairing already. So they were continuing to get smaller, but they were already repairing. They all had an operation. We did not wait and watch for any of them. But these, at least half of them were programmed to recur because they were repairing already. So a complete clinical response might be achieved earlier with small tumours and later with larger T3 tumours. But there's no point in waiting longer if you don't get any response in terms of your circumferential resection margin. I think you have to act, and I think you have to act with more chemotherapy. And again, I'm not sure that you need to consider in terms of metastatic disease, because if you wanted just to shrink the tumour, I think you can use drugs like irinotecan, and I think you can use molecular targets as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very clear and interesting talk. I just have a comment or question regarding the timing of the short course radiotherapy, and what you showed here is that you should perhaps wait to the end of the next week to operate on the patients. But on the other hand, if we look at the Dutch data and also that we have published from the Stockholm group, is that the rate of complications increases during the later part of the week. So if you should use short course radiotherapy with immediate surgery, with respect to complications, you should probably operate in the beginning of the week, and that's also because of the inflammatory response, because you get the drop then later on, as you showed. So it's a double-edged sword in that aspect, but the oncological, yeah.
That's a very valid point, but I think many of those patients were over 75, weren't they?
So just in the Dutch trial, but we have shown in the Stockholm trial that the same effect, and also in the previous Stockholm trials actually the same effect for all patients. But in the Dutch trial, you were right, it was over 75, they had worse survival actually if you operated on later in the week.
But there may be other issues, like you didn't have a ITU bed or other reasons like that.
No, well, I don't. Well, it's run. Yeah, I don't know. But I think we will have more data coming out on that. Are there any questions from the audience? Then I could continue with one more question, if I may. Do you think there is? What do you think is the with the chemoradiotherapy? We tend to delay the surgery more and more. Do you think there is a outer border where you should definitely, you have to decide, for example, for a complete response at 15 weeks, 20 weeks, or do you think it could be even further?
Well, I think it's easier. I think you have to look at the trajectory. I think if your trajectory is, it is getting better and it is continuing to get better, I think you can wait. I think the difficulty comes when the trajectory starts quite good and then it levels out and it's flat. And I lose my nerve, and we've lost our nerve and operated on some patients, but actually I don't think that very often we found a pathological complete response there. Mostly it's been fragmentation, which you might say, okay, that might have become a path CR eventually. But I think you need to look at the trajectory very carefully. And I think if you look at patients who've got an involved circumferential margin at the beginning, I'm much less enthusiastic about watch and wait.
Yes, Evangelos.
Do you think that all patients should be considered according to their MRI staging for giving them neoadjuvant treatment and tailor the interval for surgery? Or we have to take into account some additional features from biopsy, especially? I mean, you treat the same way patients with a locally advanced tumor but good features otherwise, and the same way with patients who have a signal-rich cell carcinoma or a mucinous carcinoma, because usually they don't respond whatever you do.
Well, I agree. I mean, those patients with big, advanced signet rings, I usually give them folfoxiri now. I don't bother with the radiotherapy, I give them folfoxiri.
No radiation at all?
Not to start with,
Good.
no.
Yeah. Okay.